Chautauqua Books is pleased to be speaking with Helen Ebersole. She's a longtime resident of this community, a contributor and friend of all the historical centers and the historic societies in this region. She's also the author of many books about Chautauqua County, the history of, first of all, the trolleys in Jamestown and Chautauqua Lake, the Chautauqua Lake hotels, and a book on the impressive record of the Jamestown Journal, 1826 to 1941. Helen Ebersole has also written a book about Robert H. Jackson, longtime resident of Jamestown, Associate Justice on the United States Supreme Court, and Chief United States Prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials following World War II. We are going to discuss her first book. It's called Electricity and Politics, Jamestown, 1891 to 1931. The subject of this book is both timely and important, as we have a present situation that is greatly concerned with energy, with electricity. The story of electricity in Jamestown is one that we can relate to today. We are concerned about who controls electricity and energy, how it is produced, and at what cost. When the BPU in Jamestown, the Board of Public Utilities, was first formed, it managed to keep the rates very low. Even in the 1900s, early, it was 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, it is 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to what New York State's average is of 17 cents per kilowatt hour. The Board of Public Utilities, also known as the Samuel Carlson Electric Generating Station, is the oldest and the most successful municipal power in New York State. It is also one of the largest of the 47. It is actually the largest of the 47 municipal power companies in New York State. We would like to talk to Helen today, Helen Ebersole, about her book, Electricity and Politics, Jamestown, 1891 to 1931. She can very well tell us what life was like in Jamestown.
It was much more early settler kind of life, although Jamestown had attained city status in 1886. So obviously they had a big enough population for that, and enough of a civilization for that also. The first the first electricity came to Jamestown by the Pennsylvania Gas Company in the late 1880s. And they were the ones who provided whatever primitive electricity they had at the time. Before that, everybody lived by candlelight or kerosene lamps and firelight, as we've read in the early histories. But as I say, the Pennsylvania Gas Company was in existence. And then, then a man named Thomas Smith came from England and established a cotton mill down in the center Brooklyn Square area. And he made a generator in his basement, a steam-powered generator in his factory, and lit his factory with electric lights. And then because he was making some, he put about 12 more lights in the neighborhood near his factory also. And that was the beginning of electricity in Jamestown. The man was called Cotton Tommy Smith because he had the cotton mill. He was very, very successful in his manufacturing process. Then it became such that people wanted more electricity, and a group of well-known industrialists who had the money got together and established their own electricity, which was called the Jamestown Light, Electricity and Power Company. I don't know if I have that exactly right.
Jamestown Electric Light and Power Company,
Light and Power.
1887.
Yeah, right. So Smith established his in 1880. around there. And then they established, they provided their own generator and their own working materials, and started to produce electricity for their industrial plants. And then I have to think about this, because the Smith then.
Was there some competition?
Just wait, well, yes, well, that's what I'm trying to think, and I should know this, why I can't think of the second company that
Well, it was still the Pennsylvania Gas. They were competing
yeah, well, there were
with
three
gas
companies
lights.
in competition. What the point was that the municipal plant was born in competition, and it endured competition practically its whole existence, as far as my work was concerned, was always in competition, which made it actually a very strong factory or process, because they kept fighting the others. The other competition was a private company, which had been established by these industrialists to light their factories. And of course, this was a commercial venture, and then Cotton Tommies were taken over by the city as that became then the municipal light plant, and it was in competition already with these factory who were some of the richest and most successful industry, the furniture manufacturers and the woolen mill people were very prominent people in the city, owned what came to be known as a privately owned company. At that point, it was all local. There was the bigger outfit had not come into town at that point. So the competition was immediate between these three companies. Which one? Well, then they had the city company that just few lights to light the street lights, and they got the franchise to light street lights. And then people who paid the rates said, here's this private company, they're getting money to light their factories and other factories. They're earning money. Why can't the municipal plant do that also? But because of restrictions and so forth written into their original city charter, they were only allowed to do it if they got a special permission from Albany. And that was one of the drawbacks, that they had to wait for anything they wanted to do. Like if they wanted to pave a street, they had to go to Albany to get permission to do street paving. Everything was separate. But they were able to write a law that was satisfactory to Albany that put everything under one heading, all city improvements under one heading. And that they got that through Albany, and it was kind of a cloak and dagger effect in which they went to Albany almost secretly and lobbied the mayor, the governor, whom some of them knew, to get this rule through. After that, they didn't have to wait and get each thing approved. So that enabled them. Then they very quickly put through city council this ability to light factories if the factory bought their electricity. And of course, then that started the competition with this other one that was owned by the industrialists and some of the leaders in the city. And it was the beginning of the Jamestown municipal light plant, which was in the 1890s by this time.
We had several characters involved that helped this along: George Martin and Samuel Carlson, as well as the mentor to Samuel Carlson, Mayor John Amell Johnson, during that period of time.
Sam Carlson at this point was quite young. He didn't enter the picture, the political picture, till the early 1900s, and he first was elected to city council. But he was really idealistic, and he saw that he wasn't a socialist, but he had socialistic ideas. He saw that a group going together could do some things more cheaply and efficiently than people trying to do some of these things by themselves. And this sounds very current almost. I mean, he listed things that were already being done by a group like the postal system. And then he said a number of other things could be done more cheaply by a group like the city, such as health care, which I say sounds a little bit current. And
Fire departments, police departments?
well, all those, because a city is chartered to provide the health and safety of the citizens. That's part of their chartered purpose. So the municipal plant, then Sam Carlson was first on the council, and then they separated the street lighting. They established a street lighting department, and he knew that's what he was more interested in, so he went off the council in early 1900, this is, and so he could be appointed to the electric, it was called the Street Lighting Council. And they had charge of where the streetlights would go and where they would sell the power to and all that he was more interested in, seeing that the rates were low and more people could get electricity. The people who served on the board of the municipal power plant agreed they never took any remuneration. The technical people were paid. I mean, the engineers and the people who had the know-how to make the electricity. But the ones on the board, which became a very important factor later on when they're trying to reduce the cost of their rates in competition with a big company which came into the city in the 20s. It was called the Niagara, Lockport and Ontario Company, and they of course had to pay their board members, and they had big expenses, and that's one of the reasons that the municipal plant could keep rates low, which was the part of the real active competition between the two companies. But they did. I think the city also paid for things that were not written into the municipal board's budget, and this became a point in the final trial that they had, that they brought this out, but it didn't make any difference to the three-man judge panel that the city, well, I mean, the buildings were on city land, but they didn't pay taxes, whereas the industrial people, the private people, had to pay tax to the city. And there were a lot of things that, if you looked at it objectively, the city kind of took advantage of the other company. At least that's what it seemed to me as I read the book and the records and so forth. But the competition became keen after it was in these private hands for quite a while, and in the teens, the Broadheads bought the whole thing, because the Broadhead family, of course, was very prominent in Jamestown. Of course, the first Broadhead had the furniture. What's his name? William Broadhead is one who came from England, and then his two sons, Almut and Sheldon or Selden. I'm never quite sure which is it.
So the Broadheads bought the private company?
Yes, they bought the private company because they owned the whole transportation system around the lake. Mm-hmm. They own, and in the city, they owned the streetcar system, and they owned the two railroad lines, the Chautauqua Traction and the one Chautauqua Lake Railroad on the other side of the lake, and they owned the steamboats also. So, and they had need for a good bit of electricity. So in let's see, 1913 they electrified all their lines, mm-hmm. and they bought out. But in actually it was in like maybe 1909, somewhere around in there, that the Broadheads bought the whole private company. They had been stockholders in the private company, and then they bought the whole company and owned it from then on. And as I say, but they weren't a threat because they had a need of so much electricity for all their endeavors that they didn't. They paid the rates. They kept with the municipal plant, but they didn't make any problem. It was the 1920s the competition really began after the First World War, and then there was a lot more call for electric appliances. People began to, not only lights, but they would get sweepers and washers and all sorts of electric motors were made then at that time. And so that was what caused the real competition between the two, the private company and the municipal company.
But that was primarily the Niagara company that did some tactics.
Well, they
resorted
both
to a number of.
Well,
tactics.
they did, but I think they both did. Among which if a new house was built, sometimes they would keep an eye on it, and if that people hadn't hooked up with one company or the other, their agent would quickly go in and put their stamp on it or their license that this house will be lit by whichever company, and there were, I think both of them sort of indulged in those dirty tricks. Or they would go to the village hall and ask for the license and say, I represent this house and so forth, without the owner's permission. And sometimes there was just too much trouble to change, and the owner just left it the way it was. Then there was this problem of ornamental lighting came up. Who was going to pay for that? Now, ornamental lighting is when you take down all the lights that hang down in the middle of the streets and bury the wires and everything underground. And that was in the early 20s. That argument went on for quite a while. The municipal plant said they would do any street if a majority of the residents of the street voted to have the ornamental lighting installed. But then everybody in the street would have to pay for it, even if you didn't vote to have it. But it took a while to get this established, and so then the private company came along and said that they would, well, they asked the municipal company if they couldn't share, like, we'll put up the poles if you put up the wires, and sort of work together on it. But of course the municipal company would have none of this. They would not. In fact, they paid hardly any attention to the proposal, because at that time they were well ahead in their surpluses, and they were lowering the fee, like 4.5 cents, and then 4.5, or 4.5, and then 4, which the private company, with its paying the taxes and paying all the expenses, they just couldn't take care of that. They couldn't meet it at all, and so that is what finally led in the end in 1931 to when they finally. They had a hearing with the Supreme Court, in which Robert Jackson, represented the private company, because he represented a lot of the big industrial firms when he became quite well known, probably the best trial lawyer in Chautauqua County, and he represented them to this hearing, but he had good points explaining that this private company had to pay all these fees, but the city always claimed that the private company, the board of the BPU, and the city were two separate entities. They had nothing to do with each other. They each kept their own books, which of course was not exactly true. But they said the only things they paid were things directly related to the running of the power company. That would be on their books, and that's what they figured their fees, their rate fees on. And of course, they were always lower And so they had this trial. It was a hearing before 3 judges, and the counsel for the city was Rogerson, very prominent lawyer in the city. But the 3 judges came back and said, what you need to do is just have, right, it was kind of a cop-out, it seems. They said, just, you need to just write down all your expenses and do a whole thorough search of both of the company's expenses. But at that point, the private company realized that they weren't getting nowhere if they would demand another trial, which they doubt that they could get another hearing. So they, at that point, began to talk about selling the company in 1931. And that's where I end.
The city itself ignored that for a long time because it came up a little earlier. And why did they did they want them, I mean, well, you would think that they would accept offers.
Well, I don't know. They were very independent, and I think they attribute this to the fact that they were all Swedes, but there were others also. But they were so proud of their company, and I don't think they wanted to deal in any financial way with this other company, or they were maybe suspicious that the company would be doing them out of some monies that they didn't realize some way. I don't know, but they did. They just ignored the company, the other company, pretty much.
The city,
the city, yeah, ignored the private company, and which sounded like they would wanted to. As you say, in earlier times, and here again, they would have wanted to work some way. But the company was the municipal plant was very suspicious. They said no, and the people in charge, Franco Anderson, was the man who was the head of the board of the BPU first, and then Carl Peterson, very good businessmen, owned companies and so forth, and so they both just wanted to keep the company the way it was. They didn't want to mess with buying or selling, or they were just, but they knew they were, and they kept building up these surpluses. As a matter of fact, they helped pay off some of the city bonds when they were buying. Was it the
General Hospital?
What's it? It had something to do with the Jones Hill, the hospital. Yeah, they paid them off. Mm-hmm. They also, I didn't say this when it came up in the 20s. The point was to get more and more customers. As we say, they tried to steal the business of hooking houses up, but they also needed new customers. I mean, also needed to attract a lot more people, as well as these other tricks that they went through. And the president of the company, even was, because they had enveloped many other private little companies already in the state, and Mr. Corey came. I mean, and he played golf and he gave dinners, and this sort of infuriated the municipal people too. Mm-hmm. That here's this man spending all this money and showing off how rich their company is and stuff. That was in the 20s when the competition was very keen, and this company was really trying to get more people to sign up. Mm-hmm. And then the municipal plant put on this big plant, was a big show, 1925 or 7, one of those, which showed all their different household devices and the wonderful things electricity did, just to show that they could, they had lots going for them, and that was a show, just as sort of a competing thing for this president coming down and showing off his goods and his company.
Did his company, I think you wrote in your book that the company, the Niagara company, actually gave benefits to people who bought appliances and signed up for their power?
They may have. I may have said that.
You did write it, that the companies who sold the appliances would get a full fee for the appliance.
That's right. I remember. Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
I don't know much more than that, but that was one of the devices that the private company used to, if people bought an appliance at an appliance store, I'm not quite sure.
The way you described
how did I say it?
You said that the person who ran the appliance store would get the full price of the appliance upon the purchase, if the purchaser signed up for the private electricity, and then the company would get the payments that the consumer paid for that appliance over time. But it was a great benefit to the appliance dealer to have this.
To have it,
And then there were businesses who were actually given a $10 payment if they would sign up with the private company.
The people, the buyer.
Yeah, there was a Viking manufacturing company that was going to sign up with a municipal plant.
Yeah, I remember that name. I don't know what they made.
They were paid by, they would have these actual salesmen come around and pay people to sign up with the private company rather than the municipal company.
Yeah, see, they had all these tricky devices. The private company would come up with these more of these, but the public company, the municipal company, it didn't matter a whole lot to them. They had surpluses, and they knew they could lower the rates and even more, which they lowered them as much as they could to squeeze out the big private company. But
well, you refer to a number of books. You have a lengthy bibliography and footnotes in this book that make it helpful. People can go back and get those documents and see how this transpired.
Sure.
I have a piece that I would ask you to read, if you could. This is your introduction, and it made... anyway, if you can read it, it would be really wonderful.
In undertaking this investigation, I was initially intrigued by the apparent enigma of a successful municipal utility in a field dominated by private utility corporations. Furthermore, the prestige and prosperity of this example of government ownership within a basically conservative community devoted to the free enterprise system deepened the problem. The questions that arose implied a paradoxical situation. And this is something I want to talk about also.
I thought it might jog your memory.
How socialistic was the municipal electric facility? Were there capitalistic features of the operation which made it more acceptable to the laissez-faire philosophy of the community? What finally determined the essential strength of this company? Yes, I wanted to comment on that, which I think I did in the book, about this question. As I said earlier, Sam Carlson was not a socialist. He was a Democrat in the party system. But he had the idealism of and the humanitarianism of the socialists, like all the helping the poor and programs that would, government programs that would help, as I say. But in actuality, when you look at who was on the boards of that municipal facility, they were all successful businessmen, private businessmen, running their own private furniture companies and knitting mills, which inevitably that's the way they ran the power plant, and that's why it was successful. It was run by successful businessmen. But again, that is not socialist. So it was a combination of these two philosophies that it was set up to, it was set up by people who believed in the humanitarian facets of the socialism. But it was run by people who believed in making a dollar. So it was more, it was a combination of the two. But it was an interesting, also I think, I make this point in the book, that it was a confluence at the time in history of people becoming more humanitarian and these idealistic thoughts to help people and make government programs to help people or make things cheaper that everybody could have a decent home and all the or not appliances, but all the things that they could use without going hungry or living in poverty. And yet it was the same time that all these robber barons were just, you know, building these big corporations and railroads. And this was an interesting sort of confluence of two things. The same way this municipal program was run on started on basic socialistic principles and then was run on just pure, not pure greed, but
capitalism.
Capitalism, yes. So that was a point that I did make in the book that I read about, and I think somebody like Sam Carlson certainly exemplified that pretty well, I think. So,
since you elaborated on it, I'm going to give you another one that's in your conclusion, and it's just what you're saying, only a little more so.
Oh, good. Probably better than what I'm saying now. Okay, let me see. Samuel Carlson, as spokesman for the Municipal Electric Company, may have been responsible for setting this tone. He saw the struggle as the one between small, self-sufficient, dedicated local units and complex urban impersonalized operations. In the one man was imposed. That doesn't sound right.
It's a concept in the one man.
Okay, that's the way it goes. In the one man was choosing and managing his own affairs, right? In the other, he was a cog in the wheel of an industrialized machine. When the Niagara Company,
even as the Niagara Company,
I don't get those, even as the Niagara Company, thank you, unnerved by the city's cool display of righteous independence, seemed to falter and lose ground, the Jamestown plant experienced a surge of strength that came from the power of principle stoutly maintained. And then I asked myself, did I write this?
I think that there was the notion of the hardworking, principled, and honest behavior of a government that was never corrupted. And that's what made it work as a capitalistic venture and a socialistic venture in tandem with the businessmen. Sam Carlson was smart. He would actually take his enemies to task and put them in positions of power to, like on the board of public utilities, and they would do a good job as the capitalists that they were, separate from the city government.
Yeah, he made good appointments, whether they were his enemies or not. Sam was very astute and very clever, and sometimes he I don't want to say would play tricks, and I can't give you an example right now, but he would imply like he was against something, and then in the hopes that people. Well, one example, which I don't know is true or not, he was running for office one of the times for mayor, and he put out the rumor, "Get the Swedes out of City Hall." Well, this just enraged the entire Swedish population, who turned up in droves and voted for him. So he won the election. I mean, just that sort of clever.
Pretty clever.
But if you're going to win elections, I guess that's a good way to do it. So he did serve until 1927, and then he was defeated once, and he went back in office for a couple more terms. And I wasn't sure about that date, though I used it in here, that the last time he served as mayor was in 1937. So.
But following that, he went back on the board of public utilities.
I think he remained. Maybe he did. I wasn't sure about that, but it's entirely possible. And Interestingly enough, I guess I don't know how old he was when he died. Old age, he moved out here to Lakewood.
1960.
Had a house
92.
here in along Summit Street.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but he was decided when he was young, this idealism and to be a politician. That's what he was. I mean, it's a worthy career if you have the nerve, I guess, and the abilities. Somebody has to run the government.
Well, he's always been described as one of the few mayors of such a long term that had absolutely no corruption allowed within his administrations, and that perhaps is what made this successful.
Yeah, that was probably part of it. That no, he did have the one filibuster, 1916. There was a rumor on the council that some of the boards were, when they give contracts for building out to private contractors, they were being bribes were being given to councilmen to help out certain of the contractors. And the council appointed a committee, and they had a motion on the floor, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but while the committee to investigate was meeting and deciding whether these people had done wrong or not, the council was waiting to vote on whatever the committee recommended. Then the council had to vote on whether to expose these people or to say there was no wrongdoing and so forth. And in order to keep the council from voting, Carlson started the beginning and read the whole city charter, and then started the beginning. And once the mayor has the floor, nobody can leave. So, went on for an afternoon, evening, while this committee debated whether there had been any wrongdoing or not. And then they took a vote that there hadn't been any. So then Carlson, that was the only filibuster that I think they've ever had in the council. Mm-hmm. But I really feel that somebody should write a very thorough biography of Sam Carlson.
Are you ready?
Not me.
You're not ready to do that?
Well, it would be interesting. Go down Village High, and I suppose they have all the old council minutes, those things. But that would be a good bit of research. It would take a while to research all the various motions and things that he helped to pass in the years he was mayor. But I think somebody ought to do it.
So you still hear today from people around that it's a terrible thing to have a socialist power plant in our town of Jamestown. How do you answer that?
Nobody ever said that to me, but except you.
I have heard that. I've seen it in the newspaper, and I thought
they still call it socialist because it's municipally owned. I guess I would say it really could not be called socialist. I mean, I would tell them that it's, as far as I could tell from the workings of the thing, it was more capitalistic. But the fact that it was started on the basis of the city, that is a government, owning a plant like that. But Sam Carlson would have municipalized everything. I mean, the gas company, he wanted to municipalize. Of course, the telephone company, that was, he and John Wright of the telephone company were were really enemies, because he would have had the telephone company. He felt anything to do with the health and safety and so forth of the citizens ought to be municipalized, run by the government. And as I mentioned, he said there's a post office and the public safety things. Also then, but then he wanted to do it, but the power plant was the only one he was successful. He's written some biographies in which he talks about. Maybe you've read them too. They're around, but I don't know how many books there are. I mean, I think I got mine through household sales or someplace that they were available. But
well, as we're talking about Samuel Carlson and Robert Jackson, we understand that you are writing another book, or have just completed another book on Robert Jackson. Can you tell us a little bit about that book?
Well, actually, yes, it is. I wrote the book about 3 years ago, and the book is called Off the Pedestal, which means it's what Greg Peterson, who founded the Jackson Center, was really interested in. He said to me, what was Jackson really like? Like, as a person, as a man, can you find out from reading his speeches, or from talking to people who knew him or wrote things about him? So he brought me all. I mean, they had a lot of material collected already, and this was back in 2010, I guess 2011, something like that. He asked me, and so I wrote. He brought out to my house 4 boxes full of stuff, material, and then another box full of law cases of Jackson's that they had collected there. I mean, the real cases from which you could read, who said what and everything like that. So that took me about a year to get all that material organized into something that was meaningful. And then I finished that book. But then that first edition, or the copies were all sold. So last winter they called me and said, "Would you? We're going to revise it, and maybe you want to look through it." And John Barrett. Have you heard that name? He I guess is going to eventually write the definitive biography of Jackson, but he's collected a lot of material and so forth. But he hadn't looked at my manuscript the first time, but he did, and there were a couple things that he suggested were not quite right, so I corrected those and went over the book quite a few times, and then I got another editor, graphic artist here in town, who does a nice job. So we completely revised the book for the second printing, which came out this winter, but it's also called Off the Pedestal. I mean, it's the same title, and it's also we put more pictures in it, a few more pictures, and a little bit of not much change in text, except more corrections, which there always are.
Did it still deal with the period 1909 to 1934?
It's exactly the same. Of the years that Jackson spent in Jamestown as a lawyer, when he first came from Frewsburg to go to high school in 1910, 11, there, and until he left for Washington in 31. Did I say 31, 32? Mm-hmm. But he thought he could come back and practice law a couple days a week, because he really hated to leave Chautauqua County. It was a hard decision for him. But he was ambitious. He knew that things were interesting in Washington and Roosevelt. He had a slight acquaintance with Roosevelt at that point, but he was being asked to come. And the last chapter in my book, he said, all the chapters in that book are quotes from Jackson, but the last one I was seduced. He said, by the glitter and glamour of Washington. I mean, and he was a good lawyer, and he could do the work. I mean, he realized it would be interesting for him too. But he always called himself a country lawyer. That's no matter where he spoke in big, important places, he always said, "Well, I'm just a country lawyer." you know. But he was a talented man.
Tell us about the title, Off the Pedestal.
Well, if you've been to the Jackson Center, you know that there is a statue of Jackson.
Okay.
Very, very dressed up, and you know, not well, you know, the suit and everything, tie and dressed up, not formally dressed, but you know, dressed up. And this is a story that Greg wanted of somebody who'd walk down the street and say, "Hi, Bob, how are you?" kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And that's where I got the idea that to take him off the pedestal,
okay,
put him on the streets of Jamestown. So that was it.
Good.
But in between times, and I wrote a book about the Busti Mill.
You did?
About the, you know, the restoration. Back in '59, it was falling apart. I don't know if you're familiar with the Busti Mill, mm-hmm, down Busti there. And it was an interesting story that these 3 4-H girls, just teenagers, took that as a project to restore the mill into an operating mill. Mm. But of course then they got their parents involved, and they really worked at it. That was '59, and they worked on it really hard for about 3 or 4 years. They started to have the festivals, you know, like the Apple Festival they have. But one year they had like 5 festivals. I mean, you know, the Easter Festival and 4th of July Festival, a lot of work for those poor women who do most of the work. But then they cut them out. But that's their main source of income. Mm-hmm. And the people, well, on the board of the Busti Society, then the Busti Historical Society was founded to kind of shore up this effort. That's when it was started. And they said a couple of years ago, you know, we want a story of how we restored the mill, how the mill came to be. Not the whole story of the mill back to whenever it was built, 1839, I think. And so that's a sort of an interesting book. I had to learn all about how a mill works, which I knew not. I didn't, fortunately, learn how a power plant works. I didn't have to. I decided that's why it's politics.
Okay. So, Helen Ebersole, how old are you?
Oh, do I have to say?
Oh, you don't have to say. No,
well,
did say
I won't.
Been a 50-year
I was born in 1923.
Okay.
You can do the figures.
Okay,
so.
Great. Did you know Mayor Carlson?
No. He was still alive, I think. When he died in... When?
1960 or 1.
Oh, I guess he had just died. We came from Cleveland. We came in '63.
Okay.
So no, I guess I never met him. He had a half brother who ran his campaigns for him.
Yes. In the saga.
What was it?
In the saga. And, I'd have to look it up.
Yeah, well, and that man's twin daughters I knew. They lived in Jamestown, and I knew both of them. They're both gone now. But his half brother was also in politics and ran the campaign and was head of the county Democratic committee and such like. Right. Something Lewis, is it something C. Lewis Carlson? I can't. And I've met him, and I interviewed him for my book about about Sam. But a lot of good things could be written about Sam Carlson. Of course, Joni Blackman, the director of the Fenton History Society, is always looking for somebody to write a biography of Reuben Fenton.
Oh.
Which
Are you ready?
No.